engaging in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı. Ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello, and welcome today to our conversation with Amogh Sahu, my partner in crime for about 5.5 years.
That's right.
So we're going to do a little bit of narcissistic talking about our prior project, what inspired it, how Amogh and I started working together, what we learned from its failure, and I do consider Symptomatic Redness largely to have been a failure. Where we are now, we're also going to talk about Lukacs, worldview Marxism, all kinds of other stuff is going to come up today. We're going to talk about our differing relationships with heterodox and reformist political economy, because Amogh was one of the first people who got Derek, the hard-bitten Marxist, to actually take those people seriously, and I think accidentally probably talked yourself out of taking them seriously.
Yeah.
So
I had no way of foreseeing the whole MMT kick you've been on since, but
well, I mean, the thing is with the MMT kick is it's an investigation based off the idea, like I had, actually based very much off of what we used to do at SR's very, very early days. For those of you who don't know, SR means Symptomatic Redness. It was a podcast. It was an independent podcast from 2013-ish. Into 2015, 16. It was acquired by Zero Books and ran under a Zero imprint from 2017 to 2019. In 2019, because of my exhaustion with Zero Books, during my divorce, I ended the show. You can find Symptomatic Redness. The pre-Zero stuff is all available for free on Mixcloud. It's still there. I checked it the other day. So when people ask me about it, that's where you find it. The sound quality is utter shit. Particularly the first Philip Murawski episode, which we literally hired someone later to re-edit so it was listenable. I think I had like the mix wrong, and I think maybe in the initial episode there may have even been a metronome. I mean, this is how early we were dealing with here.
yeah.
You know, I recounted the story a little bit on the 4-piece SR The End episodes, and for those of you who don't know where those are, they're way deep in the Zero Books archive. It's currently owned by Repeater Mag. But also available in my Patreon because they're my intellectual property. No deal for them was worked out. I don't go after Zero for having them. I lent them for use in perpetuity, so that's fine, but you can also get them from me. However, the SR The End episodes are coming up probably in August for my patrons. So there we might need to recover some ground. I recently re-listened to those actually for this conversation to get back into our mind state. I consider SR failing, however, before it got bought by Zero Books. What do you think about that, Amogh.
I think that's right. I mean, it's interesting, you know, preparing for this episode that it's possible to like overstate how coherent the project was from the beginning. I mean, I remember like the impulse going into the first episode. I mean, insofar as I can get a sense of where my headspace was just kind of like, there are all these conversations happening about crisis theory and mainstream economics being bad, which is kind of where I was from. And there's all these new Marxist movements. There's all this stuff, movements that call themselves Marxist, important distinction. You know, let's try and make sense of all of these from a vague kind of no bullshit critical attitude. I think that was as far as the common ground was going in. I mean, you obviously had like a more developed view because you're coming from, you know, Seoul. I think you were in Mexico at the time we started.
I was living in Mexico. This was before my ex-wife had cancer, and I lived in Korea for 3 years. Doug Lain and I had started working together sporadically after an appearance I made on Partly Examined Life in 2011. It was recorded in 2010. It was released in 2011. And I had reached out to him, and he had heard of me through PEL, and then we were in a Facebook group together called Aesthetics, Politics, and Theory, which was ostensibly a group to discuss all the intellectual fads that were beginning to happen with the rebirth of Marxism after 2007 in the United States. And this was actually mostly academic at this time. So it was discussions around Badiou, Mac Davis, Zizek, to some degree, Michael Parenti, Chomsky, the post-left anarchist versus municipalist anarchist debates, which had really been going on for like 11 or 12 years at that point. And it was a time period for me before Occupy happened, but after 2007, where people were taking radical economic critique seriously. I remember Doug Henwood became more unpopular from doing an obscure Pacifica radio show to like kind of being a front person for it, although he was not consistently a Marxist even back then. But that was the milieu that I was coming out of. I had flirted with being in the I think it was the radical caucus of the radicals tendency of the SPUSA, because there was no local in Georgia, and then because I moved abroad, it was hard to formalize my relationship with the SPUSA. I eventually moved on and got sucked into Platypus Society, where I was for 2 years.
And that was connected to Occupy, right? You were
I went to Korea. I went to Occupy Yoido, which was the banking district of Seoul. I was there for several times over the course of 2 weeks. Then I went to Occupy Taipei, and then on a vacation. And then I had to go to a conference in the United States and to see my family. And so I took the Greyhound bus from DC, where I was visiting one of my two best friends, to New York to see the remnants of post-Sakati Park Occupy. I have been in contact with some Platypus people who were in South Korea, which makes Platypus sound bigger than it was. I mean, I think at this point, Platypus was probably around 200 people and like 200 more fellow travelers.
Yeah. Says much more about you than it does about Platypus.
Right. And that's the circle that I was in. I was also coming out of being, a very confused former right-winger who had stumbled into Marxism. But, if something like Compact Magazine or something had existed, I probably would have got stuck in that milieu, not the milieu I actually moved into. Because at that time, I was still very frustrated with I'm actually still, everyone knows I'm frustrated with the left. But it had come from a place of abstract frustration as a student. And I've told the story about my right-wing stuff all the time. So I don't want to go into that, but I was still lost in the wilderness, moving through various dissident political movements once I realized I wasn't really a paleoconservative. And I had been in the Green movement, although I thought the Greens platform was insane. I found it economically illiterate from either a contemporary or a Marxist perspective. So it just, this was after Nader, but before Jill Stein. This is like 2006, 2007. I get involved in the Mike Gravel campaign in 2008.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The original Mike Gravel campaign.
You're one of the original Gravel teens.
Yeah. But he went to when he lost the Democratic primary, he went to the Libertarian Party and tried to move it left. I think people forget about this. And Bob Barr won, of all people. This former Republican, former neoconservative, who found the Libertarian light around 2008. As funny as that is. And I was still involved in the anti-war movement, but I was very frustrated with how it framed things. And I thought it was economically illiterate. Like, they would say shit like, the blood for oil argument, which is just like, it's lazy. It's also not true. Like, that wasn't what. Yes, there's a relationship to petrol control, what was going on in Iraq in the aughts, but no, it actually wasn't about directly extracting Iraqi oil. And if you think it was that, you can't understand the last 10 years. Because the U.S. has been oil independent since like 2014, so it didn't need it. So, I mean, this is all about me, but this is where I was when we met. It's specifically what you came to me at an interesting time. You reached out to me. I think you were just about to graduate high school, which, oh my God, that was forever ago. And you were, I think you're you were a little, well, I'm not going to out your age, but you're younger than me. But this was about a decade ago. So,
yeah.
So, and you were going to school. I believe you were about to start college in Canada.
That's right. So I was in Belgium at the time, and then I did my undergrad at the U of T. Later famous for all kinds of reasons, because of Peterson, which is.
Well, that's fun. Did you ever meet him when you were?
Oh yes.
Okay.
Funnily enough, he was in the background of my life in some vague sense as one of the presences in the.
That's ironic that you didn't go to the Jordan Peterson conference in Idaho.
Oh no.
With us then, because. But I think at that point, no, we were still during the Idaho conference. I was still doing Symptomatic Redness.
Oh, that's right. It was Michael Brooks was involved somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the thing is, the University of Idaho would have helped compensate you for your travel. So I don't know why we didn't set that up. That was probably on me.
I mean, at the time, what was funny was that.
I think you were just really involved with grad school at the time, so I was not.
Well, that might have been right. I think that I meant to say kind of earlier on, I remember being like, I wasn't that interested in Peterson at the time.
Right.
Spending much more time talking to you than talking to and looking around. Well, yeah.
Well, I think actually that's an interesting point, because what people don't know about me is I objected to the Peterson conference. I thought it was a stunt. Right. Even though a lot of good stuff happened at that conference, I was like, I don't want to do a conference to a guy who's not going to debate us. Like what's the point of that? And I do think that played a role, honestly, in the Peterson Zizek debate eventually, because I mean, Doug Lain and Zizek know each other. But to go a little deeper on all this, so. We're jumping around in time because we have a tendency to do that because I'm getting old. And so I want to make this relevant. I did a show called Pop the Left. Now, people know that show, Pop the Left, now from the Zero Books channel, but it was an independent show. You can't find it anymore. The original feeds are corrupted. If you talk to P.H. Higgins of the Radical Thoughts podcast, he can give you the transcripts because he transcribed them for me. He apparently saved the original files. I don't have them though. So And
but that's where I would have heard you. I think I would have
that's
heard
where
you
you heard
there.
me. Yeah.
And no, actually, that was not the first place. I think the first place I heard you was actually from Alpha to Omega.
And I started doing interviews with Tom O'Brien, who I have a contentious relationship. He was the second person ever on Symptomatic Redness. And we had come into each other's orbit due to my engagement with Andrew Kleiman. And then my engagement with other burgeoning, refound, obscure left figures. So this was a time period before, I think people forget that between Occupy and the Bernie campaign in 2016, so that's about 4 to 5 years, there is a lot of experimentation with different kinds of obscure leftists who were resurrected partly because their entire corpus was not available in English. So like Bordiga was one of them. And that was also partly driven through the endnotes early episodes, and then people rediscovering the French ultra leftist Gilles Duvet. I don't know if that's how you say his name. I've pronounced it 100 different ways. And I was reading a lot of that. I was also reading a lot of post-Trotskyist and Trotskyist material. I was reading a lot on the history of Maoism because I was just getting out of living in Asia, and I was in Mexico, and there's a living tradition there and trying to understand that tradition. And I had my first of many infamous public breakups with Doug Lain. We had worked together in a literary journal that had gone poorly, and then we had clashes over him editing Pop the Left in ways that I thought made me sound like I was a Marxist humanist, like with Andrew Kleiman. And even though I was highly influenced by Kleiman, there were tensions between us even early on.
This is even before you met me, to be clear, because this continued. It's because if you snip the sentence you just said, you could have been talking about 5 years later.
Right. Well, I mean, and then so I quit doing Pop Left, and I quit guesting on what was then the first incarnation of the Diet Soap podcast, where I was a semi-regular guest on things like Adorno, Foucault. Who else did I talk about?
Althusser,
René Girard. I did a whole lot of, because I had a debate with Doug Lain about how much I hated Althusser, like very early on. And so I was getting frustrated, however, with the lack of understanding of practical politics. I was also frustrated when I got back in contact with Doug Lain and we buried the hatchet, how Doug had moved to a more and more, because of his break with MHI and lead up to the Bernie campaign, he'd become more and more sympathetic to a reformist agenda. And I have become more and more sympathetic as we talked to electoralist agenda, kinda. So I had been convinced of the revolutionary strategy as stated by Mike McNair. This is what kind of informed the original show. Then moved away from the sort of left communist position to a united front from, and this is a position I still have, but a united front from above and below. So you focus with workers, you make forays with leaders, but you don't give them money, you don't join their party, and you don't front their party. So like if you're in a parliamentary system, that means you don't form a coalition with them. And in the US presidential congressional system, it means you don't enter their party formally as who becomes tied into their donor track. That was my strategy, not because I thought that the electoral path was going to work on its own, but because I thought totally foregoing it, like we had in left communist and anarchist circles when I was coming up, even after 2008, where I've been involved in the Gravel campaign,
right,
was not going to be useful in an environment where it looked like the Democrats were resting on their laurels and that they were going to start really losing again. And I didn't want us to be associated with them. Just like, actually, that's identical to now. But I did think we had to meet people where they were at, and the only way to do that was strategic issue voting and participating in local government to build up socialist blocs, etc. And then I did this big push for what I thought at the time was going to be the IWW as a clearinghouse of a pre-party left that ended up becoming the DSA as we did our show. And so as we did our show, there was an intense period of about a year where I was editing it and we were coming out monthly. And we actually, interestingly enough, I think you and I entered it together with a very vague project. It was two things, and I think one of its missions came from Pop the Left, and that mission of me exploring leftist history. But unlike Pop the Left, where it's me going in and researching and distilling that history, it was a lot more like what this show is now, where I find people that I do not totally agree with, but share, like, I'd say, I mean, these numbers are arbitrary because you're talking about qualia, but like 50 to 70% of a worldview. Like, we agree on enough that we're talking about the same things. Like, we define socialism similarly.
Right.
If we have debates, like our debates with Stephen Keen, it's about like interpretations of Marx or Marxology. If it's about, and some differences in policy, because I thought that what was proto-MMT, what we were calling MMT back then, actually, and what was calling itself MMT back then, was not the Innis Knapp chartalism. It was the Minsky MMT post Keynesianism, and the distinction between neo-chartalism and that form of post Keynesianism was only clear to people like Warren Mosler, who was kind of at the time sort of a marginal figure. So we were interviewing people like Steve Keen and Philip Morawski, people who are not now associated with MMT, but because MMT discussions around, and again, this is forgotten, but we were dealing with Syria and Grexit.
Yeah.
And Syria isn't so much directly relevant to this. That was me doing something else. But Grexit, in the debt crisis and the pigs, was where we were arguing, and in fact, you and I were in a constant debate between each other about whether or not small states could run an MMT policy and why. And I knew that I didn't trust gold money ideas of currency. And I knew that in Marx, it was underexplored what non-commodity money really was, even though it is in volume 2, although most of his discussions of non-commodity money in volume 2 are credit money.
Yeah.
Not fiat currency.
And I remember reading Brad DeLong and Paul Krugman talking about David Harvey's constant claims about, like, the hyperinflation is coming, or the debt, about the debt problem in the US. And I remember thinking, like, wow, a bunch of these Marxists sound a lot like libertarians,
right?
Or, and I remember finding that suspect. That I was like, there's something off about this.
And I remember the other thing is I was like Marxist. My response was the opposite to yours. I was like, why do so many of these Marxists sound like underconsumptionist Keynesians?
Oh, right.
Like, you remember, like, because I was like, I reject, and I still actually reject a lot of Keynesian economics. I think people, like, the MMTers actually probably know it better because they're always arguing me about my bad physics metaphors. And I'm always like, well, a critique of an analogy is not a critique of truth. And this, that, and the other.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, I realized from debating people like the aforementioned never going away internet crank Jehu, who I used to do a blog with. I think people don't know this because this blog doesn't exist anymore. There's a blog called Symptomatic Redness. That's where the name came from. And it was Jehu of Goldberg Marxism fame. Also of I used to be a Ron Paulite and now I'm a Marxist fame. Me, I believe Doug Lain, and I think Ross Wolf, and this guy named Art Cabrera, who ended up being involved in Natasha and going crazy, all did this blog called Symptomatic Redness. It was canceled because we couldn't all work together.
Cancelled in that it literally disappeared.
Yeah, and then
you
it
get
like,
cancelled.
Right. We canceled it.
Right.
And then I did another joint blog with about half that crew called The Disloyal Opposition to Modernity. The problem with Disloyal is that a lot of people got more and more into trolling the libs, and it sort of went into a kind of dark place in regards to that. So this is all a bunch of history that no one cares about. We now rambled on for 20 minutes, but it's actually interesting what our first project was. You came to me with a program called A Title of Opinions, and I immediately told you couldn't do that because I was already a podcast out of the University of California by that dude from Stanford, Robert Harrison, and it's a good podcast. Still listen to it, and it's one of the old ones. I mean, it's been around like for 15 years or something.
2005 it started or something.
Yeah, I started listening to it in like 2007. And it's actually one of the inspirations for Varn Blog, actually. But you came to me and were like, okay, I want to do this conversation on the history and models of education. You did this one episode of this one YouTube podcast that you put up as an undergrad that was 4 fucking hours long.
Which is still up.
It's still available. You can find it. And I swear a lot in it, and unfortunately, because I was really frustrated those days. And I say unfortunately because it's one of the podcasts that people find with my name in it before I started doing all this other stuff on YouTube. And it was so people were like, wow, you swear a lot. But we did this super long history of like Catholic educational models, different educational models in Latin America, the truth about that, what's it, Ken Robinson
creativity stuff,
the falseness of it, the fact that it was basically complaining about a factory model and trying to move to just-in-time manufacturing for consumer goods model of education, which is hilarious now. And I did this long piece with you, and you know, it probably got, that's probably only, even today, probably only has like 2,000 watches or something. It's like not a lot.
Yeah.
We did that, and I quit working with Doug Lain. And I think after a couple of months and a few phone calls, and you were like, hey, do you want to do a podcast with me? And I was going through all this stuff. I had left Platypus Affiliated Society. I had broken ties with Doug Lain. I was beginning to get involved in what would become the Proto-Marxist Center, although I wasn't really involved with the Marxist Center when it actually formed. I became more involved with something called the Red Party in 2013, 2014. And I became obsessed, and you can hear this in the Early Emancipation Materials podcast, if you can find those on the internet somewhere, with what it would mean to make Marxism more scientific according to a modern philosophy of science criterion and not a 19th century German philosophy of science criterion. Because one thing that I have always rejected is the idea that people in modern contexts can actually completely resurrect prior interpretive frameworks and their epistemologies and assumptions in ways that are one-to-one. So, for example, I don't think there are modern Platonists. There are people who are inspired by Plato, who have developed Platonic thought. Sure. There are people who have Platonic views on the reality of math. Sure. There's nobody who has, because a lot of it's esoteric even, a modern Platonist view of the world.
Yeah.
What
makes this more complicated? What makes this more complicated for Marxists is that, you know, unlike other forms of thought, it's supposed to be a historically evolving position,
right?
Which is why this kind of statement can't be the end of the conversation. It's an open question whether there can still be Marxists, which is why we've spent so much time hashing that out.
Right. So we had this. I mean, the question was, there was two. Could Marxism be scientific in a modern sense of the term? This project is eventually kind of scaffolded off from Symptomatic Redness into Emancipation Materials, which very early on you were involved with. Emancipation Materials worked with a lot of people from Swampside Chats. This was before the formation of Cosmonaut and the Emancipation Network. As we talked about it, there was three tendencies. There was the neo-Kautskyist, Leninist tendency, and I specifically link those two together because there's a neo-Kautskyist that agrees with Mike Metnier that is Lenin skeptical, and that's going to be people like Tom O'Brien from Alpha to Omega, people like Stephen Hamill from The Measures Taken, who will be on the show again soon, actually. So then there is the Lenin adjacent, which is a lot of the CPGB PC itself, Cosmonaut Magazine, particularly around Donald Parkinson and Parker McQueenie, to a lesser degree Amelia Davenport, I believe, is what she goes by now. And the kind of constellation of people who move towards that trajectory. Then there are people influenced by Tad Teza from Australia and his anti-politics. That would be one of the members of Swampside, whose name I should know. Grant from Swampside Chants, who eventually left. My mutual longtime friend Joseph Sorrentino, who was involved in the Red Party with us. A person I knew from the IS tendency, a former Cluffite trot from Australia named David Relance, and a few other like anarchist people who got involved, mostly from the Red Party split. And we did this collective research project called Emancipation Materials. And originally Emancipation Materials came out of two things. What we were doing at Symptomatic Redness, and my massive attempt to read every major platform, program, or statement of policy by every large political Marxist political party that I could find in English. So I read something like 70 historical platforms, and then I read also several party constitutions and started compiling them to figure out how to write one for the Red Party. This goes nowhere. The Red Party dissolves. It doesn't join Marxist Center. I no longer, when there was the Marxist Center convention, I no longer had an org that was attached, and so I don't go. And then we get bought basically by Zero.
Taking over,
Now, okay, so that's all that. So what it became clear to me, though, about a year and a half in, that our goal on Symptomatic Redness was to put Marxism back in dialogue, originally with heterodox economy and philosophy of science. So that's why we were talking to Stephen Keem and Philip Morawski.
That's right.
And who's the other? Fagin, who's the scholar of the Soviet Union who is highly critical of Kautsky?
Oh, Yakov Fagin. Yeah,
Yakov Fagin.
He's gone an interesting direction since then. But
yeah, we interviewed Yakov Fagin. We famously interviewed and lost an interview with Eric Olin Wright because it was on my computer, and we interviewed Leo Panich. We interviewed Ashley Frawley of Zero Books fame. We interviewed Tom O'Brien. And really what's interesting is it's not a long run. So those first interviews, there are those interviews. Then there is a series we did where we did a exploration of the idea of cultural Marxism, which has never been completely released, where I read all this right-wing material and went through what was correct and what was made up in it. We did something on the Sui Park scandal at the beginning of counseling, and back when we talked about call-out culture. We did a lot about that, actually. Right.
There was more anthropology-focused things about identity and mimesis and kinship stuff.
Yeah, we did a whole lot of stuff on René Girard.
Mm-hmm.
We did stuff on what would Marxist and Hegelian anthropology look like. We did a whole episode devoted to Marshall Solins. We did a whole episode. We did several episodes devoted to Haider. We lost episodes that we recorded devoted to what's his face, the guy who wrote the China book, the China India book.
Mishra, there was that.
Yeah. P. Mishra.
Yeah.
We did several.
That was about that book, Age of Anger, I think.
Right, Age of Anger, which we kind of tore apart, actually.
Yeah.
And it was funny because I liked some of Mishra's other work, but I found that one. We did a breakdown of Adorno's Capitalism or Industrial Society. We did a breakdown of part of negative dialectics back when we were trying to figure out why people think Adorno is a Marxist.
Mm-hmm. And also you were being associated with Adorno a lot.
Yeah, very much at that time. Yeah. And we did a lot. The thing is stuff recorded after our initial 12 episodes, we had trouble releasing. And so one of the hard things about, we've gone through this winding history back and forth for years now. But one of the things that happened in the production of this process is we kind of clarified what our question was, but then we hit a wall, and the first wall was just production. I was taking care of a spouse with cancer, and I moved to Egypt, which had unstable internet.
I was either in or going to grad school.
You started to go to prep to go to grad school, and then went to grad school.
Yeah. This would have been around 2017, 18.
This is between, this is 20. This really starts, I think, in 2015, but goes between this time period. I moved back to the States, and then Doug Lain, I think in 2017, offers to save Symptomatic Redness because he needs more material behind the Zero Books paywall. And he asked me to head up 2 podcasts, one on culture and one on politics. I was like, well, we already do Symptomatic Redness. It's independent. We'll throw it your way. It was behind a Zero Books paywall. Unfortunately, and I don't blame Doug for this deliberately, but one of the things about being behind the Zero Books paywall is actually our public profile dropped. So people knew what we were doing in 2012, 2015, even though the milieu of leftist podcasts were much smaller. But when they exploded, we were behind a paywall and not an independent entity, and not even obviously had our own show. Like, we were now a sub show that had a few public episodes. The rest of it was behind the Zero Books paywall. And this is when leftist podcast is exploding. This is, right post Chapo making bank on Patreon. Patreon now seems viable in a way it hadn't in the past. You and I had tried to start a Patreon for Symptomatic Redness, and we got like $2. And the thing that kind of happened with the original Symptomatic Redness is I was trying to hire an editor because while I was dealing with my sick ex-spouse, I could not edit and produce and be in and work a day job and deal with living abroad and take care of her spouse with cancer and also edit a show. So, but we didn't make enough money to make it worth any editor to do. So I worked a little bit with Esri XB from Swampside. But the more we worked with them, the more that we found that our side projects got subsumed in what would become the Emancipation Network. And you became less and less involved because even more than me, like, I am skeptical of some of the claims of Mike McNair, and I am very skeptical of not even the claims of Andrew Kleiman, but the framework in which those claims are made. And those were taken as nearly gospel in those circles. Although with some cases with McNair, there's been more pushback since then. And you were initially invited on, I believe, is it the Kleiman?
It was to talk about the Kleiman book.
Yeah. And I think the lack of skepticism there turned you off. And so SR stays sort of independent. Now, also, since SR had been bought by Zero, by this time, we couldn't join up in the Emancipation Network. And so, long story short, and then I'm going to let you talk about why it was so meaningful for you after 40 minutes of rambling. Long story short, I felt like the project had failed, and I didn't feel like I could resurrect the project. I had recorded a year's worth of back material one summer, which is funny. But I mean, literally, like I had interviewed Ben Burgess and Ben Alshire and just a ton of people in 2018. John Michael Cologne, Michael Brooks, and you and I had recorded a few episodes, but since you've been in grad school, you just hadn't had time, and you also didn't have you didn't always have appropriate equipment, you know, and whatnot, and Doug didn't give that to you, so so it.
Which would have made, by the way, which would have made sense for him to do since it was a Zero thing,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, the thing is, they did it for me, but not for you, even though it was our podcast.
Yeah.
And I also kind of felt like because of that, you were less and less involved. It became more of a me show. Through complications due to cancer and a bunch of other things, I get divorced, and the only thing I did publicly about my divorce, because, you know, I think it's always weird when middle-aged dudes make like multiple episodes about their divorce on their political show, is I said that I was stepping back for a while, released the year backlog, which bought me 7 months of time. And we then decided to end it. At the end, we came together, we recorded our last 5 episodes, I think.
Yeah,
it was a long string of episodes, actually.
Yeah. It took a while to end. It says SR at the end, but the end takes a long time.
The end is like 7 hours long. And we wrap up the project, and I think it became clear, actually, ironically, in those episodes, what we were actually trying to do, and that we had failed before we ever got into the Zero orbit. It's because I don't blame the failure on Zero Books. I blame it on us losing track of the question. And now I'm going to really, now I'm going to really turn it over to you, because my thesis is we got sidetracked by both the attempt at Marxist Center, which is a small thing that, you know, has dissolved now, but we were never involved with the actual organization, because our organization that was involved in the pre-formation of it dissolved before we got there.
But they were around. Like, we were conscious of them as like
we were around. They were around. Then we had the whole, we got involved in the emancipation materials debates between neo-Kautskyism and anti-politics, and I almost uniquely came off in the middle between those two factions, where I agreed with the anti-political people on a lot of the critiques of politics as such, and represent politics and what Bernie had ended up doing. But I ended up thinking that they they privilege the social in a way that let anybody with anti-systemic energy at all say they were representing society. And they also thought that there was a social well-being that I did not see. So I was more pessimistic with them. And I also didn't think politics as such was inherently bad. that that I thought the anti-political turn was a result of failure, not a good in and of itself. And so that put me slightly more towards the neo-Calc camp. But the neo-Calc camp became what I considered to be politically determinist. So they increasingly would insist that politics existed outside of an economic framework, that the politics of the working class could be manifested by the left, not by the working class itself, that left unity was where that would emerge. What left unity means has changed for them several times, but that was what they were heading for. And I didn't feel like I could join them there. And you had a completely different set of questions because you were still struggling with, ironically, I felt like you were both more of a worldview Marxist than me by this point, and that I was taking more stuff from other ideas. So I was pulling more from systems theory, from complexity theory, from cybernetics, from Marshall Solins and David Graeber's anthropology, although I ended up rejecting Graeber pretty hard.
Good for you.
And before it was cool, but you know, I was pulling from that. I began to take MMT more seriously, not just as a philosophy of enemies, but people doing real research, even if I disagreed and still disagree with their conclusions. And I felt like Marxists had foregone, ironically, in their political turn. So you had the constant crisis predictions of the late aughts into this totally politically determined idea that Bernie could just bring us there, or that Bernie's executive campaigns would launch a workers' movement sui generis, or that you had left unity and now you had a unified left subject in the DSA. And I criticized all these things before it was common to do so. But what was interesting is when I criticized them as Symptomatic Redness, no one ever came after us. When I started criticizing them on Pop the Left, I started being told I was a fool. So it was a very interesting scenario, and that's when I realized, oh, people didn't understand or even hear what we were doing on Symptomatic Redness. Yeah. Okay, so that's my version of the story. It's now taken 40 minutes. Guest, co-host, person who's listened to me blather probably more than any other person to Doug Lain. What was your experience of all this?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think back because in retrospect, I feel like a huge amount of my political development has happened under Varnism. Like, I mean, and this is probably unique amongst all unique amongst all other stimuli have been the aegis under which I've developed any politics that I have, which is a very scary thought. But you know, look, a decade on, I mean, now there's just you just have to, just in terms of raw time spent, it's just a fact. And that's been, and you know, and anyone who's listened to you for a long time might be thinking why haven't I jumped off a bridge yet, if that's the case? You know, but I think less jokingly, I mean, it is true that a lot of people, the longer they listen to you, the more they have to keep two sets of books, right? This is the, you know, I'm sure you can say this for other Marxists who've spoken to you. It's oh, well, this is the space in which we indulge Varn's theoretical skeptical concerns or whatever, skeptical concern. And then this is the space in which I actually do my politics, right? It's and so, I mean, this is the experience you have often of people listening to you, you know, where it goes in one ear and out the other, and
they hear the critique as a critique of their enemies, and then don't take the rest of it to heart.
That's exactly right. This is this kind of selective application, and part of the reason they have to do this is because they have some independent political commitment. So I didn't have any of those. Strangely enough, what I had, I got from you. I mean, not got directly, but you know, so. I mean, I kind of been asking myself like how I survived like exposure to the political kryptonite that is that is the kind of like you know, galaxy brain Varn skepticism. You know, again, I know you don't intend for it to be this way, but you're aware that like the thinking has this kind of effect. I mean, for me, it's because I was always an academic, and here I mean an academic in the sense of a tendency of thought and being rather than a profession. I've since come to realize that those two are not the same thing. You know, that I was always interested in questions of theory and method, and that whenever I was faced with some disagreement on the show, I would always ask a question like, well, what does this even mean? Or how would we resolve this? Or, you know, some other set of sources has to be drawn on or something, you know, or other options have to be explored or something like that. And it's like a lot of the reason I was able to keep at arm's length of a bunch of like destructive stuff that happened to other people that you knew, or, you know, not get swept up by political movements, was because I had this kind of more abstract armchair tendency, which has obvious limitations. And I knew this, but the benefit has been that, you know, I'm not as touched by a bunch of silly and destructive tendencies of thought that a bunch of people on the left have gotten caught up in, and specifically our section of the left.
But would you like to be specific without calling people out? Like, I know it's hard to do, but let's talk about like what are these silly tendencies that you saw people getting caught up in?
Okay. I don't know silly tendencies. Yeah. So I think I would say I didn't end up, despite initial involvement, and I was part of the reason I was interested in people like Steve Keen and Philip Murawski was because I was involved in this kind of hybrid think tank academic thing called the Institute for New Economic Thinking, which was a kind of breeding ground for post-Keynesians, for MMTers, and for various other people, funded by George Soros, which exactly. No, it is literally openly funded by George Soros.
I know.
Yeah, exactly. It's and you know, it was interesting. I mean, in INET, I guess I would have read Sraffa, but I don't think other than that, Marxist ideas were really that in vogue. But yeah, through that, there was a kind of connection to social democratic politics. And I remember, you know, Jamie Galbraith, the son of John Kenneth Galbraith, who's become this very famous left economist, invited a bunch of INET people to a call with Yanis Varoufakis before he became finance minister. And like there was some connection to social democratic politics,
right? And that was also, and I think one of the things you saw about me was me mocking Yanis Varoufakis before it was cool to do.
Oh, so. That's right. But I also felt the need to like have some kind of middle position or have some kind of skepticism about the kind of hardcore Marxist critique of reformism. I don't think at the time I really knew exactly where I wanted to end up. But in any case, the point was that I was in these two rooms. I was with you, and I was also with these heterodox economists who were significantly to the right of you. You know, and I would say that was trend one that I didn't get caught up in, that I ended up not doing anything with INET. I ended up not having any academic projects in economics at all. And I think actually part of the reason I didn't end up studying economics and thinking more about heterodox economic stuff was as a result of my interest in Marxism. That heterodox economics didn't end up being that fruitful a framework, at least at the time. It was presented in this more kind of Keynesian light. And the interesting thing about that
when did Mitchell and Ray's textbook get released for MMT? Because I feel like this is before that.
Yeah, this is a lot before that. I mean, there were textbooks. I mean, at the time MMT, it's important to understand that the big thing was post-Keynesianism. MMT was understood
as a very small policy implication set of a very small set of truths that had policy implications if you wanted to use them.
Exactly.
And let me look at when this book came out. So the Mitchell, Ray, and Watts microeconomics textbook, which is one of the foundational ones. And MMT comes out in 2019. So like this is way before that.
Way before. This is 2014, 15.
Yeah. And this was also back when everyone was charting modern monetary theory back to Minsky and not back to Knapp and neo-chartalism.
That's right. That's right. It was all about, INET, I would say like a strong 60-70% of INET output had the word Keynes in it somewhere. That like people were obsessed with Keynes, were obsessed with the Keynes-Marx relationship. That was the big issue in like the more left circles. We also spent a huge amount of time thinking about that, although obviously in a different way.
Right. I think the only modern monetary book that I remember that's associated with current modern monetary theory that was already out, and we did not read it, was Soft Currency Economics 1 and 2.
Oh, that was the Mosler book, right?
Yeah, by Mosler.
Yeah.
And then I think the pamphlet that kind of makes him famous, which is like before the Kelton book, was the obvious MMT book, was the 7 Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy, which I believe came out in 2010.
Yeah.
But this was before those people were really seen as driving a movement, or they were super attached to the New Center, the Institute for Economic Thinking, which is still mostly post-Keynesian, but does have, like Nathan Tankis has done stuff for them and
That's
stuff
right.
since then. But it's interesting because people seem to talk about MMT as like it's this old tradition that, and I'm like, no, there's literally like 100-year break between MAP and Ennis and then anyone picking this up. And what I find interesting is there's been, and I probably will get in trouble for this, but I think there's sociological reasons why the post-Keynesians and the MMTers have moved further apart, and particularly in light of where like Paul Krugman has gone and back into the Larry Summers camp and picking up the old early Keynes fear of inflation. The difference is in early Keynes from modern concerns about inflation is Keynes thought you handled inflation by tax policy, not by monetary or by fiscal policy. Monetary policy, fiscal. I'm always getting them confused. But basically the Fed, it wasn't the area which you handle that. Recently, Summers and a lot of the orthodox neo-Keynesians, and people get mad at me for calling them orthodox, but they are the current orthodoxy if you're in an economics department, have reincorporated monetarism into Keynesianism, and they've also picked up the Swedish labor conflict cycle. So they actually think to suppress inflation, you need to hurt labor, like explicitly.
Yeah,
and that's actually a Keynesian right perspective, but it's a Keynesian perspective from the same people who are like mint the coin in 2009.
Yeah. That's right. I mean, I think we at INET, I shouldn't say we anymore. At INET, we would have seen ourselves as being on a spectrum, like in the same conversation as people like Krugman and Summers.
You would have seen yourself as like to the left of
that's
Krugman
right.
and Summers.
That's right. Roughly the same perspective as like Mark Blythe was very big in those kinds of circles. Adam Tooze, although he's much more prominent now than he was then, was very important. But yeah, there was some sense of like for instance, this is going to be laughable to someone who actually knows the history, but like there was a proud association with like European social democratic traditions and like left social democratic thought. I remember this. Mark
Blythe, and I used to make fun of you about that, actually.
That's right. But I mean, I think in the context, it would have been like we were contrasting ourselves with these like ridiculously technocratic Americans who had no traditional history of any kind beyond like, managing austerity programs on behalf of the World Bank and WTO and Treasury. I mean, people need to remind themselves that Volcker was originally like considered a kind of leftish Fed chair, for example. Oh, exactly. And the thing about these more kind of like left social democratic figures was that they used to talk, unlike a lot of mainstream economists, they used to talk about history, to talk about institutions. And they were, I remember, refreshing to me primarily as like look, they're at least talking about something, was what I would have said. And I kind of just like, Marxism was not really at that time clear as like a practical political alternative, even in the way that it is now. You know, it was much more just like, oh, this is the thing I talked to Derek about.
Right.
It was like, it was less clear exactly how you would be a Marxist. I mean, I was always, you know, I'm a, you know, upper middle class bougie kid, and those are my prejudices. And so like now it's become, you know, now trust fund kids are kind of communists by the boatload, but that is something that has grown over the decade.
Yeah, that was not the case when we started. Like,
that's right.
It wasn't also the case that like Marxism was like super working class. It tended to be from people who I feel like the fail son stereotype was becoming true. And then there was also a lot of us who, there was also this counter trajectory where you had a lot of people who were even conservatively minded, came out of the blue and white collar working class, and in my case, blue collar, and who, through the course of the aughts between the war, the racialist turn of paleo-conservatism starting under the Bush administration, but it was very crypto before that. It actually is weird to realize how much of this stuff was in code even during the Bush administration that it's not in code now. And so, yeah, I think it's interesting because I think at that time, it was a bunch of people who became Trots in college, people attached to International Answer, but a lot of them, I would say, was a mixture of people who were downwardly mobile and upwardly mobile. What connected them, and this is true for me too, is that we had at least spent some time in an academic milieu, and we had leisure time devoted to politics.
Yes.
What was different is I was at the time one of the only people who'd even, and I was not in a union when I started doing all this stuff, but I had tried to unionize something in the aughts before it was a common practice, like before there were all these graduate student unionization attempts and this, that, and the other. I had tried it in 2004, 2005 as a conservative even, and got my ass handed to me. But you know, that was an interest. That's like an interesting development for me because it tells you where I was at, because I was pro-union as a conservative. Right. And so, yeah.
This is why you said earlier that you would have this interest. You'd be much closer to Compact if it was around then. Right.
I mean, I think if, and that's how they tried to get me, actually. I mean, like the right did throw Christopher Lasch and people like that at me. Back at a time before that was common or cool, or there was no post-social democratic post left. The post left back then was tied to primitivist anarchism and Hike and Bay and all that.
Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing for me in terms of this, how I eventually ended up getting out of this left social democratic milieu, wasn't actually for political reasons at all. I mean, there are times when I still think temperamentally and class-wise, I kind of remain there, even though intellectually I'm not. Eventually is really just because of theoretical questions. It was because of just like hearing, you know, on one day of the week, people talking within this like reformist framework about what could be done in this concrete day, hearing all this Marxist talk, hearing all this anthropology, hearing all this stuff from different theoretical perspectives. And my reaction to that was basically to try to retreat into even more abstract philosophical questions about method and metaphysics and blah, 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 you know, in order to try to get some kind of like vantage point on all of these different frameworks, which were coming from different places. I mean, part of this was just like the confusion and the cognitive dissonance of just like trying to get all the different people who I would have spoken to across a week into some kind of continuous conversation. And that led me in the end just out of politics entirely into philosophical questions. There's also, as a completely as an aside, biographically, I came into college as an econ major, and someone wanting to do economics, and very much as someone interested in stuff about Minsky and financial crises and modeling credit cycles. All of that got dropped, funnily enough, in reaction to a milieu where everyone said the thing you had to do was to read political economy. But all of that got dropped when I realized that I was much more interested in thinking about these very high level questions about well, what is a worldview? What does it mean for people to disagree here? And all this kind of stuff. So I kind of, as a result, there was all this political stuff happening around me. But by the time the Bernie stuff got started, I was in a completely different place. Mm-hmm. And I kind of did not leave that grand hotel abyss. I guess it's not right to call it a grand hotel abyss. It was much more just agnosticism. I didn't really leave that until 2019, 2020, and since, where I've gotten involved in a small way in local DSA stuff. And but mostly, part of the reason I've hung in to some kind of political sanity, despite the sort of, galaxy brain skepticism that is my own political instinct, is because, my interest is primarily in these super big picture theoretical questions that end up allowing you to take some distance from some specific practical commitment. That's had problems of its own, obviously. The most obvious being that you end up just watching a lot of stuff happen, not be able to do that much about it, and you end up also being kind of alien to your own kind of political tendency. So the Bernie stuff happened and wasn't really involved with any of it. Kind of just watched it happen. And the weird thing is, not watched it happen in the sense of, that any random person watched it happen in the sense of friends I had and people I knew and people I used to speak to, watched them, slowly migrate into higher political positions, and watched what were, economic tendencies, particularly INET stuff, which were just seminars I'd attended or crank professors that I'd spoken to, suddenly become advisors to Bernie. So Stephanie Kelton is a real blast from the past for me. I remember when she was just some random INET grantee, and I remember thinking, oh, this MMT stuff, this is just a silly way of reframing a bunch of post-Keynesian insights. And I genuinely had the thought of oh, no one's going to talk about this in a couple of years.
I mean, what's interesting is I know the MMTers think they're in the dominant future of economics, but it seems like lately they've actually been gone from a place of strength, going into when Tankis is writing for the Financial Times and Kelton is one of the most popular books on the planet, to a place of no, the Keynesians are now attacking you. Paul Krugman and Larry Summers are attacking you, and it looks like you don't have a viable theory of inflation, and you keep on throwing that you have one out and that the truth about it, but getting people to articulate it beyond the most common theory here is the Mosler one, which is it's all backdoor price setting by government purchasing, and this is greed, which I'm sorry is not true. It's objectively not true.
That reminds me of the debates we used to have at Libertarians in the Obama administration about shadow stats. That
right.
was because their big thing is Obama's hiding inflation, right? He's
Right. I mean, and what was funny is I was actually sympathetic to the fact that all administrations since the 1970s have hit inflation.
Right.
Because they don't include food inflation in the inflation calculation. I mean, I get why you don't include medical and education, which, by the way, this is the first time where they're not inflating. Their inflation's 4%, general inflation's 9%, so they're actually getting cheaper for the first time ever. But still, it's an interesting thing to see. I'm not counting the MMTers out. I think that they might have they might eventually have a strong answer to inflation. I suspect their guts. I suspect their gut inclinations are more correct than the Keynesian ones right now. But I think it's going to take a lot of PR and a whole lot of I think they're going to have to be honest about some of what they said early on, because both post-Keynesians and MMTers claimed that you could withstand a fairly high rate of inflation with no effect on the poor, which I think they're not admitting that they said.
Yes.
I literally have an MMT book that claims that you could go up to 10% without a problem. And that's now, seeing how things currently are, that seems absurd.
But at the time, I mean, the reason this debate is important is because before, let's say, even before the Bernie campaign, like ideologically on the social democratic left, or the bit that I was in anyway, there was a vague sense that everyone could get along. There was a vague sense that like there were no real theoretical disagreements.
Right, and that the Marxist, like the difference between a Marxist and Keane was this arcane argument about whether or not machines added value or not.
That's right, and the Bernie campaign initially seemed to prove that right. When like a lot of Marxists got on board, a lot of people that you and I felt maybe should have thought better got on board. You know, the Trotsky.
No, we had like communization caucuses in the DSA in 2018. Like, it's crazy to think about that. Like,
yeah. But then but the benefit of that was that like the basic things that had caused splits between the left and the liberals in the 70s and 60s were not present, right? Inflation wasn't high. There wasn't a militant labor movement. Yeah.
And I remember the big debates that I used to have with them and be like, look, I'm not a proponent of the gold standard. That's not what I'm saying was going on. But you can't deny that stagflation was existed. And I do remember people out of that new economic policy trying to convince me that it was all a policy choice.
Yeah.
And I just was like, no, it absolutely was not. Like, you had real problems in Keynesian economic planning that hit a material wall outside of the state. Again, kind of a problem if you believe in endogenous, economics to a state, and that the policy options were none of the policy options that they could have done were policy options that post-Keynesians would have suggested.
Right.
And as
long as inflation's low, though, as long as inflation's low, as long as that there aren't, and as long as
inflation's lower than 3%.
Yeah, lower than 3%. As long as that there's relatively austere fiscal policy, a bunch of people, everyone, not just social democrats, mainstream economic forecasters, everyone can kind of get under this bus of like austerity is wrong. We need to fund welfare.
Yeah, even
more.
like the IMF started sounding like austerity was wrong. Like, exactly.
And so if you kind of grew up in this time politically, you really did think like there were the smart. I mean, this is a kind of John Stewart way of looking at things. It was like, there were the smart people and there were the good people and there were the bad people. And like Marxists and social democrats and economic analysts were the good people. And there's sometimes Tom O'Brien still sounds like this, but that's another story.
Well, yeah, I mean, this was actually, I will go into this. This was one of my breaks with Tom. I was like, I'm tired of you implying that every person who disagrees with you, and by you I mean Andrew Kleiman, on specific temporal analysis of Das Kapital, which as far as I can tell has very little effect on any political anything.
Yeah.
Including how you think communism works. It's just whether or not you think whether or not it removes the transformation problem as a point of debate, which if you're not an academic Marxist in the 70s, no one has fucking talked about.
Yeah.
So I just said, I was tired of hearing all this as a conspiracy against Marx. Particularly for me, the breaking point was this attack Kleiman did on Grossman, where I didn't even totally disagree with Kleiman on some of the interpretational problems or the mathematical problems, although I'm not totally sure I agree with him either, because when I started plugging stuff in, I didn't get the same numbers he did. But I disagreed with the fact that he like accused Grossman of thinking he was greater than Marx, and then literally told me some things that Marx said about immiseration in the 1850s didn't mean what they plainly meant, because Kleiman could not have an incoherent Marx that said something that he changed his mind on, which is part of the kind of almost joke exegesis about the way Marxist humanists work. Now, all that's a long story to say that I got tired of hearing that because I don't think it's true. I think there's been a crisis in Marxism that was never a conspiracy. It was not done by the bourgeoisie to weaken Marxism. It emerged from the fact that there are ambiguities in early Marx through late Marx that are not worked out because the work was not meant to be published a lot of the time. It wasn't finished. That Engels finishes is a lot of it. He doesn't change that much of it from what I can tell, actually. You know, I've now gone through Fred Mosley's work and a lot of the philological work on this. You know, I've read a lot of the MAGA material, not just the Heinrich that's available in English, which isn't actually about MAGA at all. But the Marcel Musto and what's his face from Idaho, who does all the stuff on Engels.
You're not thinking it's not Houdis, is it? It's
no. This guy's the Engels end of them at Tarcell something. He wrote Engels a short introduction.
Terrell Carver.
Yes. Terrell, not Tarcell. That I was making. Yeah, it's Terrell Carver, who has done a lot of MAGA stuff on Engels, and then Fred Mosley, who did a whole lot of the economic manuscripts, publishing them, and then noting what Engels changed. And he didn't change that much, honestly. He cut some equations that he thought were confusing out, and this, that, and the other. But anyway, my point is like that way of thinking, that the people who are wrong are a conspiracy, and that these readings are obvious. I used to just say like, if this was obvious and true, why did none of the classical Soviet economists or whatever read this the same way? Was that also a bourgeois plot? Like, you know, which is not to say that this interpretation is the interpretation is wrong, but I got for them calling Grossman like an arrogant, not Marxist enough because he didn't trust the true way of Marx was like too much for me, and I finally lost my shit. And the thing is, I'm not even a hardcore Grossmanite, despite all the Grossman stuff that comes up. Because I don't know that I actually believe that we'll have any idea when the final crisis comes. And I don't know, since I reject the immiseration thesis off of historical evidence, I don't think that and the reason why that was relevant in my argument with Kleiman is I was pointing out that Marx in the 1850s actually wasn't a immiserationist. He drops it later, but this is why people thought there needed to be an expansion and critique of crisis theory, because in Marx there's evidence of it in his 1840s and 1850s writings. Okay, whole digression there, but that whole train of thought where you accuse people of trying to undermine Marxism because they disagree with you or because of a disagreement of interpretive ambiguity is a fundamental thinking error. And it's beyond, to me, a sectarian thinking error. It is like it says something bad about you as a person. I mean, even like that you do not have the charity to think that some mistakes are just mistakes.
Yes. This is in fact one of the features of just this whole line was that, I mean, it was part of the reason for our failure as a critique of Marxism was it was almost impossible to get any kind of agreement or purchase on what Marxism actually was, right? So, and just for several reasons. I mean, one was that it's hard just philologically. that it's hard, people just associate different claims, blah blah blah. It's hard just to put that together as an intellectual project. But also, even if we do that, even if you and I end up agreeing on what that is, it's hard to get a definition that matters to people politically, right?
Right. Like,
yeah.
Like, I mean, you and I talked about like the need to reject both political determinism, which people forget. That was a Kleiman accusation. It was a Doug Lain accusation. It was a me accusation, and actually I think we developed those critiques separately.
Yes.
But I actually thought some of the critiques that like the neo-Kautskyist, particularly around Cosmonaut, but in general made against economism, which is a belief either in the Bernstein sense that just the economy was going to develop in that way, so against developmentalism, right, or in the immiserationist sense that an economic conditions would force one response, and that response would be, mass proletarian global revolution, are like that, or economism of like, well, economic conditions will force a general strike, and the general strike will lead to, the general strike will lead to X, which nobody, including like the general strikist, apparently actually believed. Sorel didn't really believe it. Like, he thought it was a myth that could inspire revolution, not something could actually happen. I came to this weird position with you that I think is now unique, but doesn't make anybody happy politically, is that neither political deterministic thought nor economism is true, and that this was deeper than just this debate. It was also played on stuff like the base superstructure debates, where I'm like, relations of production, even in Marx, are part of the base. Some of that would be what we call cultural, and thus we just kind of throw aside into the superstructure of this metaphor, and me going, no, that doesn't work. Actually, if you look at Marx himself, it doesn't work. Like, it's not like what became clear to me is the metaphor is problematic because there are things, even in Marx's description, that fit into relations of production that also fit into the superstructure. For example, what the role of law is. And a debate that was big in emancipation materials and also big between us that we didn't go into actually on the show much was like the debates around the class neutrality or not of law. This really matters, not just for Marxism and certain Marxist claims or certain Leninist claims. It also matters for this social democratic stuff, because my main critique of MMT hasn't even been that it's wrong. It's that any attempt to turn it into to switch from its descriptive into a norm. I do disagree with its descriptive on two things, and that's a whole different debate. We can talk about that soon. But is that it posits as policy neutral something that would never be allowed to be policy neutral. So the management of the way we handle liquidity will never be allowed to be just handled by economic planners in a democratic system, even in one that wasn't broken. Because I'm like, okay, what happens when we do have inflation, and the way that you fix inflation in MMT and in post-Keynesianism is strategic taxing. That's what it's for. In fact, according to MMT, that's the only thing taxation is for.
Yes. And strategic taxing is almost by definition not class neutral. Right.
And so it's just like, so who you're going to hit, how you're going to hit them, what kind of politics you can't have an all-inclusive, thing. This will generate conflict. And I'm always like, you present this as if this is obvious, and it won't. Kelton's a little better. Kelton will sometimes admit that, like, okay, we want to tax the rich, not because we need to tax the rich, but because we actually need to control their power, and almost Piketty style, right?
Right.
And okay, fine. But then how are you ever going to do that in a democratic society like the United States, or even in a parliamentary one, where there will be a political debate in which who gets hit by how we do taxation policy or whatever comes out, why the fuck would they ever like? This was another thing, like the jobs guarantee. I'm like, the jobs guarantee would effectively end the ability of capitalists to have labor discipline beyond wages. There's no way they're going to give that up.
Right.
Like,
I mean, the thing is, all these questions are difficult in themselves, right? Already, just as a matter of social science or whatever, it's like, you know, hard to build up a sort of like comprehensive materialist theory of law, whatever, right? But what makes it even more difficult is that, like, me and Varn end up boxing with shadows, because what we, I mean, not so much don't recognize but find it hard to deal with, is that people are not always asking these questions in good faith.
Right. They're either not asking these questions at all, or they're asking these questions to do something like they have a script about what wrong metaphor you're using, or this, that, and the other, that they throw out in every single time, even when it's not relevant to what you're saying.
Right.
Like, I've had the number of, it happened to me literally yesterday. Okay. Like, I was talking to an MMTer who's regularly on my show. He's going to be back on my show to defend MMT against my accusations that it's methodologically nationalist in most instances, but not all. He wants to defend the honor of Randall Wray and Bill Mitchell in specific, and against my my inclinations to distrust them because of Fozzie. For people who are not deep into MMT world,
well, is this Thomas Fozzie?
Yeah.
Ah, yeah, okay.
Yeah, Thomas Fozzie, who's kind of gone over to the right-wing nationalist economic populism side of things, and Bill Mitchell is trying to maintain some Marxist Keynesian hybrid thought, but worked with Fozzie on a book called, about reframing sovereignty. But apparently Fozzie went, took it to more like the popular, like the popularist and all this. He tried to do Lexit, and anyway, the point of all this is that I got told that there was scientific consensus amongst MMTers, and I literally laughed at that, because I'm like, no, you guys do not agree on everything. I know you guys say you all have the same theory of inflation, but when I ask you, I get different theories. And you tell me they're the same between each other, but I've actually mapped them out, and they're not. So, like, whether or not it's supply chain breakdown, cost push, monopsony pricing, government backdoor pricing, or greed are different things. And while they're related, okay. So all this is to say that in a lot of these debates, you have to figure out who's really being sincere. And unfortunately, and this happens on the back end if people don't see it, I have a lot of really nasty conversations with MMTers where, like, I basically accuse them of lying. It's basically that, like, how do you explain the big debate that happened yesterday was I got accused of being a gold standard proponent because I've said, look, Mosler and many of you are saying that quantitative easing is the exact same thing as open market functions, when it's not, in so much that quantitative easing involves buying private long-term corporate debts and buying off long-term instruments, but also toxic assets from corporations, not just a traditional private asset buying by buying treasury bonds from the treasury, which the Fed has generally done to hit their target interest rate, which means that neither what the Fed said it was doing, trying to increase the monetary supply by doing quantitative easing and going beyond buying treasury bonds into buying more private long-term instruments, nor what you guys seem to be saying it was doing, which is this is just a more open market operations on a larger scale, is true, right? That you can say that QE is a type of open market operation, but then you have to admit that it operates fundamentally differently on what kinds of things it buys. Now, this is so arcane that people who don't know the fine points of federal policy that it means nothing to them, but it's a debate. Like, it's a debate about whether or not QE caused general inflation, asset inflation, over speculation in the market, which is where I actually stand, or has no effect at all, which is what some, but not all, MMTers say, but they will claim they all agree.
Yes.
And so when that comes up and you hit a wall, you know what they accuse me of? Being a secret gold standardist.
Yes.
And I'm like, no, I'm not. I just don't agree with. I actually believe in the Forex exchange theory. So like, so I think MMT conditions are true for the developed world. They're not true for small nations. And the reason why is because small nations have to purchase shit on an open market run by the people who do have total currency sovereignty and production power. And usually also a big fucking military. So
I mean the general point about like you want to say that there isn't a direct map from any quote unquote real commodity resources a country has to its spending power. You know, MMTers are right about that. There's not a one-to-one relationship.
No, it's you're right, and they're right that also you can't run out of money.
Yes, exactly.
Right, totally true. But the thing is, they're not the only people who say that. Like most Keynesians will also admit you can't actually run out of money.
And Marxists, smart Marxists will also say that.
Right, unless they're weirdos who hold on to the gold standard because Trotsky did or something.
Really? Oh, I didn't know this.
Trotsky. There are people who do, yes.
Oh, God. Why did Trotsky... what was his rationale?
Because he was a capital volume oneer, and that's what he understood. And Trotsky is like, just like Trotskyists have to like go on long things about Aristotelian metaphysics to like deny the Big Bang because they're pretending that like Hegelian dialectics with an Aristotelian understanding of the universe is still in an application and is somehow scientifically viable. Yeah. Which is hilarious.
But like this is so helpful because this is exactly what I mean when I say that it's this like, you know, the Marxist quote unquote research program is like a crazy Mad Libs, you know, improv show where people bring in all kinds of different shit.
Yeah, I mean, like basically what weird vestigial 19th century thing do you want to bring back in? The issue that I have had and where I'm still kind of the only issue where I'm still an orthodox Marxist is, for me, I think neoliberalism has been ending since 2007. Right? As a periodization of capital, QE fundamentally changed things. That's why my debate about QE matters, because otherwise it's hard to see what's different. But it's like it is a big difference. And what I pointed out is inequality actually accelerated in this time period worse, even though we were talking about it more, than in the classical neoliberal period from 80 to 2005. I also
realizing you ended 2005 because that's before the Democrats, you know, won the midterms, right? And they changed everything.
Well, I ended at 2005 because really you start seeing inklings towards Federal Reserve policy towards QE and asset buying stuff starts being experimented with, and
that's actually when Bernanke takes over for Greenspan, maybe.
Exactly.
Yes,
that's why. Yeah. And I also noted that that's when we started seeing shifts from people selling tech as commodities to everything in tech being based on rents, and then like that moving into like physical machines, even like you don't buy anything anymore. That starts in 2005. That does not mean that the economic policies in neoliberalism are over. They were still trying them as a resuscitation model, including under Obama, because basically Obamacare is a neoliberal public-private partnership model. Morawski was really big at making this basic point, right? But that really hasn't taken on. It's been much less effective, and you've actually seen the political calls for that kind of stuff on both sides of the aisle to slow down. Like, you don't hear as much about charter schools anymore. You don't hear as much about public-private partnerships anymore. Even in some of the bills that Biden was pushing to get through, they were still in there. But it's more as a habit of a prior economic set. Just like Keynesian policies were not completely abandoned in 1978 when it really is over. They're really not abandoned until the mid-'80s.
And the obvious marker, the Trump and Biden stimulus packages. So it's like,
you start seeing the return to Keynesian stimulus packages. But again, this is before the recession. You see the first direct payment from the government. We all got like $700 from George Bush in like 2007, like as a stimulus of it. So like there was, and I remember like the great Keynes, Milton Friedman, YouTube video that everybody
Keynes and Hayek, actually.
The Keynes Hayek YouTube video that like both libertarians and post-Keynesians shared and liked, even though it was unclear who sided with what.
Yeah. By the way, I'm not sure about the unclarity because it was released by the Russ Roberts people. The
yeah. So it was clearly that they were siding with Hayek, but
yeah.
But even the Russ Roberts people, I used to listen to Econ Talk all the time. I don't anymore, but even as late as 2016, 2017, they were moving away from their von Hayek neoliberalism into like conceding some role for the state in a free market economy, which is a pretty, if you know Russ Roberts, that's a big fucking deal.
Jesus, yeah.
Yeah, so it just tells you how much things have moved. And you know, in this weird sort of way we're talking about this, it also tells me like why I have to have these debates. Now, this MMTer, I had this debate with him, I'm not calling out by name. I'm going to have him back on the show because he actually did make some good points about me being unfair to Bill Mitchell and Randall Wray, even though, you know, he said that I probably was right about Hudson because I think Hudson's got some weird politics. Michael Hudson, for those you don't know.
Yeah.
And that he said that I was probably too harsh on Galbraith, but I was right that like people like Jamie Galbraith who keep on positing that like we're going to be having like a Eurasian global economic currency thing, and it's going to, but I'm like, China may, I know that MMT, that my MMT friends like China's going to float its currency soon, and I'm like, do you have a document that says that?
People have been saying this for decades.
I don't see that, and I also don't see a Eurasian currency, frankly, because it would break up BRICS immediately, because it would make it clear that India's economic interest is not in that. And while India has good relations with contemporary Russia, it has bad relations with contemporary China, and it would tear BRICS back apart again. And I was one of the people, you know, another thing that you and I came together on is we follow BRICS, and I was initially a BRICS proponent, and I became a BRICS skeptic, and I felt like in heterodox economic circles, I saw the same position that I eventually rejected come back up multiple times.
Michael Pettis,
Hudson has proposed it again. Galbraith has basically proposed it again. I'm like, it's not going to happen, and it's because of geopolitical tensions that you guys are just ignoring, and the fact that Russia can't consume as much as the West. It just can't. So like there's not enough people, even if it, you know, not to mention it is productive in terms of raw materials, but outside of military goods, Russia doesn't manufacture that much.
Yeah.
Like, and that goes all the way back to Khrushchev and people not listening to Khrushchev and the Soviet Union in the 60s and 70s. Like that's how far back that developmental policy goes. And that the oligarchs continued the same trajectories because that's what already existed. You know, so yeah, this is a very long and detailed way of getting into the complications. We're going to take a pause, and when we come back, so for us, it'll be about 10 minutes. For the rest of the world, it's going to be probably a week. We're going to talk more about your journey and then your actual research that came out of some of your interests out of symptomatic redness, and then where that failed and why we're talking again. You know,
sounds good.
All right, so let's take a break. I'm going to end us with the chill close, and then for those who are watching this in the future, it will be another week until you can see the second half of this conversation. For those of you who are here with me right now, see you in 10 minutes.